Oh, hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Rosalie Ganawan, and I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager at the Chinese Canadian Museum. I'm joining you all virtually from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which is whose lands we at the Chinese Canadian Museum are honored to live, play, and work on. So Remembrance Day is coming up this Monday, and we're excited to be hosting this program today that honors Chinese Canadian veterans specifically. I will begin today by watching 136, Canada's Forgotten Soldiers, which is a 25-minute documentary on Force 136, who are a British Special Operations Executive Unit composed of 145 Chinese Canadian men who served in the Second World War. Following that, we'll jump into a discussion with our panelists, who I will introduce you to in a minute, and then we'll wrap up with some audience questions. So feel free to type any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A box that is located in the bar at the bottom of your screen, and we will try our best to ask most of those live to our panelists. So joining us today, we're so excited to have Stephen Hu, Linda Yip, and Randall Wong come together to share their combined knowledge about Chinese Canadian veterans. Stephen is the director of 136, Canada's Forgotten Soldiers. He is a first generation Chinese Canadian who grew up in Vancouver, and he's also a veteran who joined the Canadian Army when he was 16, serving for 5 years with various units across the country. He has a bachelor's in international relations from University of Toronto and a master's in intelligence from Georgetown University. And he now works as a security professional in the entertainment industry in LA. In his free time, he enjoys exploring the outdoors, sports photography, and proudly supporting the Vancouver Grizzlies, despite being too young to have seen them play. Linda, many of you may already be familiar, and she's been a part of many of our programs in the past already. She is an author, researcher, and storyteller who has been invited to speak in Canada and across the United States. She is an expert in Chinese Canadian genealogy and a professional genealogist who is a member of the Ancestry Advisory Board of Genealogists and the Association of Professional Genealogists. She runs a blog called bestpresence.com, which has become a trusted worldwide resource with the readership of more than 270,000 people. She is the author of Getting Started in Chinese Genealogy, a family historian's guide, even if you don't speak or read Chinese. Linda is also the daughter and niece of two Chinese Canadian World War II veterans, Cecil Yip and Dick Yip, who you will hear more about in the documentary that we're about to watch. And Randall, the Honorable Justice Randall Wong, is a third generation Chinese Canadian born and raised in Vancouver. His family connection to the city and province can be traced back to the late 1800s, with his grandfather employed as a Canadian Pacific Railway construction builder and his maternal grandparents settling in Vancouver in 1880. Randall is a true pioneer in law, being the first Chinese Canadian to be appointed as a federal court judge in Canada, and he is the longest serving judge on British Columbia's Supreme Court, serving for 42 years until his retirement in 2016. Outside of his law career, Randall is very involved in the Chinese Canadian veteran community. He is the honorary president and associate member of the Chinatown Army, Navy, and Air Force Veterans Unit 280, and the current president of the Chinese Canadian Military Museum. So excited to have all of you here today and to be watching this film together. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen for this video. Hope everyone enjoyed the film.
Um, okay, so we're gonna move into the discussion portion now. I always like to start by asking film directors about their experience making the film, because there's usually some content that gets cut in the final version. And Stephen, I remember when I was first chatting with you about doing this program, you kind of had an interesting way of getting involved. This is only the second film that you've made. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that with the audience?
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, it was sort of an accident that it all came together. But what happened was so in 2022 when it all started, I worked on a film with Robert and Leo Chan, who are related to Arlene Chan, also Leo in his own right, giants in the Toronto Chinese community. We worked together for the Queen's Own Rifles on a documentary about the first Chinese Canadian lawyer uh, in history, Doc Yip, and we shot that for Asian Heritage Month in early 2022. And right after that, I think, yeah, it was the day after we shown it, I went on my first deployment overseas. I was out of Canada for 6 months. And then when I came home, Robert was generously enough to invite me to come along for a holiday party that Leo was throwing. And he was talking about for 2023, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The city of Toronto wanted to do an event to create something that would highlight the contributions of Chinese Canadians. And what I really like about Leo's perspective is that he really wants to focus on the positives. Yes, there were historical injustices, but he really wants to focus on all the accomplishments that we made in the past 100 years. So Robert, being a former airborne infantryman, a career soldier, he and his friend John O'Connor, who was instrumental in also helping put this together, also a very decorated veteran in his own right. They've been really trying to get the story of Force 136 told for a while, but ran into a lot of dead ends. And I was moving back to Vancouver, and I got connected with John, who moved out there. And this is probably my favorite part of the story was when Linda emailed me because like right before COVID, I emailed Linda about a school project when I was a student at U of T, about a project that I was working on about Force 136. I had to interview somebody that had a connection to it, and I read her amazing article, The James Bond of Chinatown, and I wanted to do my project on that. Linda didn't respond at the time, but then in Christmas of 2022, responded and said, "Stan, I am so sorry, but it's probably too late now." And I thought, well, guess what, Linda? This is perfect timing. So that's how really it got all started. So many people really got involved. We were able to finally connect with a few folks, and we were able to get in touch with Gordon and Robert at the same time. Really saw Chris, Colonel Weicker. He was doing a lot of work, just finishing up his master's, I believe, writing about Force 136. So all really just came together with that. So it was kind of jerry-rigged, very last minute, but I was, incredibly honored to have that to be, delegated to help with that and being able to connect with, really giants in our community, the Chans, Linda, Gordon, who's I think one of the last surviving members of Force 136, happening at such a short amount of time, with King Long as well. So just an incredible group of people who were able to come together to really tell the story finally.
That's such a beautiful full circle moment to
Yeah.
have learned about that story of, Linda inspiring you to do this research and then now having both of you together here today. Yeah, Linda, I'm curious. So I know you talked a bit about, your father and your uncle a bit in the film, but were there any other stories beyond those that were shared in the film that you wanted to expand on or share?
That's a great question. It- The the thing about the story of Force 136 is that both my father and my uncle really kept mum about their participation in the war. And honestly, if my father didn't participate in the Remembrance Day parade every year, I would almost not know that he had enlisted and served. Now, I did acquire both of their World War II records from Library and Archives Canada, and I waited 4 years for Dix. So you see, even though it's a free service, you may need some patience. And referring to Stephen's reference, the James Bonds of Chinatown was my exploration into this hitherto really unexplored story. Now, this is before retired Colonel Chris Weicker published his incredible thesis. And I've changed my opinion on a number of things about Force 136 since, because I've learned so much from him. But at the time, honestly, I combed dozens of books. I went through every bookstore. I read indices in so many history books. And there are hundreds of books about the Second World War, and there still isn't much out there in terms of research. So the story behind the story of how one finds Force 136 and Stephen contacting me writing the blog, then getting involved in the documentary, I love this story. And I actually, the Chinese Canadian Military Museum has sponsored a project. I'm the project coordinator, and we have Colonel Chris Weicker at the National Archives right now researching this very subject. So it could not be more timely to be looking into this again.
And I know that there have been a few other documentaries and projects that have been done about Force 136. Like there's the Operation Oblivion film from 2012, I believe. And that had interviews with some of the members of Force 136 while they were still many more that were alive. What other resources could some of you share for anyone who's interested in doing further research on Force 136 or about Chinese Canadian military history?
There's Wesley Lowe's documentary on Douglas Jung, but I am the Canadian delegate that came out about Doug Jung's participation in Force 136 and his experience upon becoming the first Chinese Canadian member of Parliament in 1957.
Okay, thanks for that, Randall. So there was one part in the film that I think really stuck with me that you said, Linda, which was that, you know, your father and your uncle came back from serving in the war, hoping that they would be coming back to a changed Canada and a changed society, but they were coming back to essentially the same society. Could maybe you talk a little bit about that and, you know, some of the ways that things remained the same and how that eventually led to change, and specifically like what was changed in the aftermath of these veterans serving?
Okay, well, I'll start, but then I'm going to need some help from you. But for my father, he did say, you know, that he felt that nothing had changed when he first got back. We weren't there and we didn't live through it, and so we have the perspective of shortened timelines for history. But the war ended in 1945, and it was 2 more years before the Chinese had to fight again. So there's a phrase, what was it? Two battles, 1 war. That the Chinese fought. You know, there was the Second World War, and then there was the fight for civil rights. So first there was the repeal of the Exclusion Act in 1947, and then there was also the change in the Dominion Elections Act. But those things, even with those huge changes and the ability to then vote, the committee to repeal the Exclusion Act still had to go back to the table and spend something like 20 years working to unravel some of the other less well-known laws, such as the Orders in Council, which still prevented Chinese families from reuniting. And so it's a more nuanced story where Chinese Canadians fought in the war, and then fought the Exclusion Act, and then fought the Elections Act, and then fought the Orders in Council, and it just goes on and on. And so I do think for my dad, he was a little overwhelmed, I think, with, you know, having proved that he was worthy of being a citizen, and yet there was still so much fight left to go.
Randall, do you have anything that you would want to share from your perspective, especially as a judge and someone very familiar with the different laws that were in place?
Well, the British Columbia Statute of 1872 was the first one that came out and provided that no Asians can be on the voters list. They specified that they covered East Asians, Chinese, Japanese, and also Aboriginals. Aboriginals did not get the vote until 1960. Now, as a result of that prohibition, then that meant that if anyone wanted to enter into the profession of law, medicine, pharmacy, chartered accountancy, engineering, and architecture, these were self-regulating professions that required the right to vote. And if you couldn't vote, then you couldn't enter that profession. There was in 1918, Juan Camio's son, Gordon, who later, after the end of World War II, when he got the right to vote, became one of the early notaries. A sympathetic lawyer took up his challenge to the Law Society and in the court to have Gordon be registered with the Law Society. Although the judge was sympathetic, it was black letter law and it was quite clear, and he did not succeed. Now, what happened then, of course, in British Columbia, if you couldn't vote, then as far as voting federally, it hinged on your eligibility to vote in the province in which you reside. And if you couldn't vote in British Columbia, you couldn't vote federally. It fell as a matter of course. And racism actually was quite rampant because I was on the committee that did the study of that history for the city of Vancouver subsequently to make its formal apology. And Mayor Gregor Robertson was the one who offered the city of Vancouver's apology. And our committee discovered that racism was so rampant that basically there were restrictive covenants, particularly in the British properties, developed by the Guinness family in the late 1930s. And the Guinness family had sponsored the building of the Lionsgate Bridge in order to facilitate the sale of homes and development in the British properties. But it had a restrictive covenant that prohibited sales to Asians. And it went even so far as to prohibit any Asian domestic help from residing in the white employer's home. Now, out in Kerrisdale and Shaughnessy, as mentioned earlier, most of the domestic help were the Chinese houseboys who lived with families basically for decades. And yet the restrictive covenant was there. And that existed basically until the 1950s, when the Supreme Court of Canada, in a decision, decided that these restrictive covenants were contrary to public policy and therefore unenforceable. Now, these restrictive covenants are still on title, and you can see it today, but realtors will tell you that don't be concerned about it because it's unenforceable. But if you're sensitive about it and you don't want it there, you can pay a fee to the registrar of titles to have it removed. But a lot of people don't want to spend that money, but it's still there. Now, I think Gordon mentioned about restrictions of Chinese into indoor swimming pools. Well, that has some relationship to Force 136, because I remember Douglas Jung telling me that Chinese, if they weren't allowed into the like crystal pool indoors, they never learned really how to swim. And when they joined Force 136, they were taught not only how to swim, but how to swim silently. So that was another burden that members of 136 had to learn, besides the commando skills, but also swimming. And the city of Vancouver also had restrictive contracts. In other words, when they tendered for public works, there was a provision for builders that you do not use Chinese labor. That was right there in the contract. And of course, the first Chinese hired by the city of Vancouver was not until 1952. And so you can see that why the Chinese were restricted into Chinatown, and if they ventured outside Chinatown, they had to be prepared to be ostracized and to fight. Now, however, when and this is one of my personal recollections, because my mother's youngest brother, Delbert Yen Chow, was not in Force 136, but he was a Canadian infantryman who was training in India for the expected final invasion of Japan before the atomic bomb was dropped. But before then, he had to go to England, where they took further training, and then ultimately his regiment was shipped to the Pacific. And basically, he was 19 years older than me, and after the atomic bomb was dropped, and as Gordon Kwan mentioned, they didn't have to invade Japan. He came home on the troop train, and I remember vividly, because I was about 5 then. My mother woke me up and said, "We have to go down to the train station because your uncle is coming back." And the train station was at the foot of Seymour, which is now the Seabus terminal, and at that time it was the Canadian Pacific Railway station. And I remember vividly the train coming in and my uncle alighting from the train along with all the other soldiers in his uniform and carrying his knapsack. And basically we were overjoyed, and we took him home. And a few months later, he, like a lot of veterans, basically applied to go to UBC because the federal government had an education subsidy for returning veterans to attend university. And he did enroll, but what struck me as being interesting was the fact that because he was away for so long, he didn't have any outer coats. So a lot of those veterans going to UBC initially wore their tunic coat of their uniform as their outer jacket. And you could tell that they were basically veterans. However, some of the veterans told me upon coming back that, and even during the war, before they were shipped overseas, if they ventured outside Chinatown and they were wearing a Canadian military uniform, they were treated differently. They could see that the reaction amongst people was quite a change. And as a result, I think the war did promote some acceptance. And therefore, that was the credo of the returning veterans. It was one war, two victories. In other words, one in defeating Canada's enemy, And the second one is the fact that later they were able to obtain the right to vote. And that's my personal recollection of that time.
Yeah, that's such a valuable, point of view, and I think so special because given that you've lived through such a period of time where so much change has occurred, like it's such a recent history that, as I think it was said in the film, many people don't know about this these days. There was a question in the Q&A about why it took so long for us to know about Force 136. Were they sworn to secrecy to not talk about this?
I think Linda can tell you about that one.
Well, but I think you know it better. The Official Secrets Act was in place for 30 years, and correspondence within the group reinforced the secrecy for the returning members of Force 136. I think another reason why it's been very difficult to research this story is that it's really been dependent on speaking with the survivors of the Second World War and getting those first-person interviews, because Force 136 was part of Special Operations Executive, and that was under the auspices of the British Army. So Canada loaned the Chinese Canadians to the British Army, and all of the records are therefore not in Canadian archives. They are housed at the National Archives in London. And so in order to research the documented history, which first of all was classified up until about 30 years ago, but secondly, you had to go to a different country to research Canadians, if that's a bit strange. And so I think while their mark on history is immense, and it plays a part in giving us the freedoms that we all enjoy today, but because they didn't talk about it, and it's also been difficult to research, and there's the Official Secrets Act, and the records are not in the country, I think those are also contributing factors to why documentarians like Stephen Hu, when they get curious about a question, that they have to marshal all resources to see who knows something more about this story. Stephen, you should talk more about that.
Yeah, like on top of what Linda talked about, and as we talked about in the film, I think even the living history aspect of it, and Linda and I talked about this the first time we spoke. A lot of the men who did end up deploying didn't really get to see a lot of action. So when they came home, there was also that feeling that they might have not really done their part. So, and this is something that a lot of veterans even today deal with, is that you sign up to play the game, right? If we're using a sports analogy, you practice so you can play. And for a lot of these men, they simply just didn't get to do the thing that they were trained to do. So there was, to a certain degree, that feeling of, a sense of internal guilt that didn't do the thing that they really wanted to do. And of course, with all the other things that were the co-founding variables, right? Being loaned out to the British Army, the classifications that made it really obscure. And I think just how discussions about Canadian military history is that, we focus a lot on certain events that gain a lot more, I think, a lot more attention, right? Not saying that people who participated in those major events that we commonly know about don't deserve it, but a lot of the other stories about different kinds of Canadians and their service to our nation, it's only coming more recently to light thanks to really passionate historians who are doing the work to get the story out there. So, for example, most recently there was a new project that was done about the No. 2 Construction Battalion that fought in World War I, which is a all-Black battalion that came out of the Maritimes that participated in World War I. And of course, the Sikh veterans who also played a major role participating in fighting with the British Army around the world. So I think it's more of a recent movement that finally that, all perspectives of Canadian military history is getting told. But it's really because of all these different factors that we talked about. The unfortunate, I guess, the unfortunate fact that there was not a lot of living history, and then coupled with the difficulty of accessing archives. And it's really just the passionate folks that, really do care about our country and really care about our history, who feel that, who understand the importance of educating current generations of this story to really bring it forward.
Yeah, I also wanted to just mention on kind of the topic of more information about Force 136 coming out in kind of mainstream or for the public, is also that as Catherine Little, I see, has joined us today, she's actually the author of a children's book called Endgame, The Secret Force 136. And the London Drugs Foundation actually donated 2 copies of this book to all the schools and libraries in all 4 Western provinces of Canada. And so Force 136 story can be told or is accessible for anyone in these schools, and to pass it on to future generations, which is really amazing. And as part of that, I also wanted to give a little bit of a plug because their publisher, Plumleaf Press, actually donated a few copies of Endgame as a giveaway for the attendees of this webinar. So Janice has just put the link to the book on the publisher's website in the chat, but I'm gonna throw in a survey link, a feedback survey link, where you could be entered into a giveaway for a copy of this book if you fill out the survey. And yeah, there's also a lot of resources that Janice is sharing kind of in real time in here, but we actually have a list that we've kind of compiled that we will share after the chat, and try to get all of these sources up on the Chinese Canadian Museum's website as well, so that it's accessible for anyone who comes to look for this, because yeah, sometimes just finding that starting point can be difficult. I wanted to ask, so in this film that we watched today, there were primarily stories of Chinese Canadian men who served in the war, but I'm curious about the women's stories. Can anyone share some stories about some of the women who served in the war? Randall?
Yes, there were several women, mainly from Victoria. And I should tell your audience there that in the courtyard of the Chinese Cultural Center, there is a large plaque that lists the names of every Chinese Canadian who served in World War II, both in Canada and British Columbians who served in the United States Armed Forces, because some of them did sign up to serve for the American Army or Navy. And you can see all the names in there, and you'll see some women's names in there, and they were with the Women's Army Corps, and they were basically stenographers and working in the offices in administration. There was also Peggy Lee, who was with St. John's Ambulance, and her name is listed in there too. So there have been, and Mary Bo Kong, Steve Coe's family there, also had the sister, Mary Bo Kong, who served with the Canadian Army. So that there have been some women listed in there. So I would really strongly suggest that if your audience is interested, go to the courtyard. You can enter through the Sun Yat-sen Gardens entrance, because the front there, since COVID and vandalism, is blocked off. But you can gain access by coming in through the Sun Yat-sen Garden entrance, and just turn to your left in the courtyard, and there's a huge plaque there, and take a photograph of it so that you have a record of it.
Linda, do you want to share?
Yes.
I have a story I'm working on, and again, it's a little light in documents. I'm hoping to get to Sea Island at some point because there's an archive, an airline archive of all things. So my great aunt Lily, my mother's youngest, almost youngest sister, worked in a secret factory job during the war. And the only thing that she would say about her war experience was that they were building big machine parts, but it's a dread secret. And she had very fast hands and she was promoted to supervisor. And I am still riveted by the idea of this petite, pretty woman, a teenager, being supervisor at a machine factory plant. And so research suggests that she may have worked at the Boeing plant assembling boats, I think the Canso boat or plane. And there is one photo of her taken in 1943-44, where she's wearing a white uniform, and it is an exact match to the women who worked as Rosie the Riveters on Sea Island in Vancouver during the war. So it isn't just, the women's stories of those who enlisted and worked, in the offices, but also the secret stories of those who worked in the factories. And I also want to give a plug to everyone who tried to serve by enlisting in the Merchant Marines, who were not Navy, but still served on the commercial vessels, serving the vessels, all over the war. And because my father enlisted in the Merchant Marines as well, and that's how I know about them.
I have a personal aspect. When I was first appointed as the first Chinese federally appointed judge in Canada, Doug Jung took me to a veterans dinner at the WK Gardens. It was one of their reunions, and all the veterans were there, including members of Force 136 and the others. And Doug announced that I was appointed as the first federally appointed judge in Canada. And there was an uproar from the audience there. And I felt extremely gratified that they were so pleased that this finally had come about. And I really owe it to them. And as a result, I've been a student of military history for such a long time. And you could see the expressions on their face that they were so pleased that a younger generation has finally got something that they were striving for and fought for.
Yeah, your presence in your career is so inspiring and so extraordinary that, within these few generations, we've been able to be in your position when those like Juan Alexander Gamiao, was prevented from becoming a lawyer despite having trained for that. There was a question in the chat that I wanted to forward. So about Force 136, many of them knew that them serving would be, they may not return. It might be just a one-way trip. Did any of them get cold feet and change their minds about wanting to go? And did anyone ever talk about their fear of getting caught or getting killed, potentially?
Yeah, I could speak a little bit to that. So the 150 men that volunteer for commando training, about half of them volunteered for operational service. And what was actually cut from the film was Gordon talking about how they received cyanide pills because in the event of capture, Force 136 agents, along with all SOE agents, they were expected to commit suicide because the intelligence agency could not risk them being tortured to give up sensitive and classified intelligence that the Imperial Japanese Army could exploit. So definitely, it was with the mindset that if they were going to go on these missions, it was going to be a one-way trip. And Gordon also did talk about that. He also joked that, when he joined, he was 18, so he didn't really know better. And if he were to do it again, if he knew all the facts, might have had a different opinion. But I think it really just speaks volume to the courage of those men and Linda's uncle and father, that even at a time when they were not even citizens in their own country, they were still willing to do the things that they did. They volunteered fully knowing that this was what was expected of them, going over to the Eastern Warfare School, taking training for airborne insertion or combat swimming. It was made abundantly clear that yeah, it was a one-way trip and it was a suicide mission. And I always think about that quote in the Bible where I'm forgetting the exact verse citation, but it's talking about who shall I send, and and somebody puts out their arms, say, I will send me. And I think that just speaks exactly to what these men did, that they were willing to do that because they wanted a future better for the next generation, to have the life that they never got to possibly enjoy. So we really owe them a debt of gratitude. And certainly as somebody who ended up pursuing the military as a career at a very young age, standing on the shoulders of giants, especially being here and listening to Bud Wong talking about growing up, and that's where you just shared with Doug Young. It's very inspiring to be standing on the shoulders of giants.
I might just add that today there are only 4 Chinese Canadian veterans still around. I will name them. These are the following that are still with us, and they are basically in their high 90s or possibly have already celebrated their 100th birthday. There's Charlie Lee in Surrey. There's Gordon Kwan, whom you saw in the documentary. There's Victor Wong, who's also in Victoria, and Tommy Lee. Those are the 4. And of course, next year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. So basically, I'll make a plug for a soldier for all seasons. There is one aspect that will be shown, and there is the first Chinese Canadian naval officer was Lieutenant Commander William Lohr from Victoria. And he had an important role because when Japan surrendered on August the 15th, 1945, Commander Lohr was selected by the British Admiralty to lead the liberating forces to liberate Hong Kong. And Commander Lohr wrote a diary about that time. And basically what he said was that he led a delegation from the ship onto Hong Kong and approached the prisoner of war camp, which housed the Canadian garrison who had defended Hong Kong before the Japanese overwhelmed them in 1941. And the prisoners of war suffered extreme hardship, and it was slave labor, and they were in poor physical condition. And when Bill Lohr walked in there, they were really surprised to see an Asian man in a Canadian officer's uniform for the Navy. And the first thing that Bill Lohr said to them was, "Hi, fellas, I'm Bill Lohr from Victoria, and I'm here to take you home." And there was a big uproar, of course, that they were glad to see him. Now, he wrote a diary about those days, and later he had it, his secretary transcribe it and typed it out, and he authenticated every page. that authenticated diary was given to a university professor friend of Bill Lohr's, and that donor last summer contacted me when he was coming out here, and he said, would you like to have the authenticated diary signed by Commander Lohr for your museum? I said, by all means. So that authenticated diary, which will state in Commander Lohr's own words about the liberation of Hong Kong, will be on display. So that's a plug as to what is going to be part of that new exhibit. And I might also mention that it wasn't strange for returning veterans not to talk about their experience. This was pretty well universal. I've heard it from all types of veterans, Chinese and non-Chinese. They just didn't like to talk about it. And it wasn't until they reached at an elderly age that it was time that maybe they should open up a bit. And that's when the only time they said anything. So it was hard. I think that a lot of veterans, when they came back, because of the hardship, and some of them actually developed alcohol problems, and there were lots of homes that were broken up simply because of the separation from their families.
Yeah, definitely. I can, I can only imagine how traumatic it is to see live action, but also just even the training regiment and the purpose of that weighing so heavily that people don't want to discuss that in later life. And yeah, it's very special to have those who have decided to open up and share their stories so that we can understand and empathize with what they went through. Yeah,
you know that Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau introduced and made multiculturalism a part of as official federal government policy some time ago, and of course that was a good thing because we are all immigrants at one time or another, and it's nice that we can introduce other immigrant families, our culture from where we came, and likewise. And in such a Vancouver, it's so cosmopolitan that really you don't have to leave town in order to savor in any type of international food. But there was one comment that rang true for me, and that came from Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. He said at one time, there should be no such thing as a hyphenated Canadian, because after all that's said and done, we are all Canadians. And I think he meant that in the sense of you can take pride in multiculturalism, and that's good. But in the end, we have to become one, and that becoming that one creates a national glue for all Canadians who live here. And that's what Prime Minister Diefenbaker meant at that time.
In the spirit of sharing some of the words of people before, I know Linda, when we were meeting before this webinar started, you mentioned wanting to share some words from the government just to kind of illustrate the climate of the time. Would you like to share those now?
Sure. Thank you, Rosalie. So it's hard for us today, living in 2024 in Canada, with all the rights and freedoms that we have, to imagine what it was like in pre-war Canada. And so I would like to share this letter. It's very brief. It's from then British Columbia Premier Patillo to then Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. 23rd September 1940. Dear Mr. Prime Minister, I have been informed that it is the intention to call up for war service Japanese and Chinese citizens. I most strongly urge that nothing of the kind be done. In the first place, it would put the Japanese in possession of arms, when recently measures were formulated to collect arms. Perhaps an even more important consideration is that if they are called up for service, there will be a demand that they be given the franchise, which we in this province can never tolerate. There's one more paragraph, and then, with all good wishes, I am very sincerely yours, Patello. It's very clear.
Well, you know, Chinese who wanted to enlist for the Air Force and the Navy, when they came to British Columbia recruiting centers, they wouldn't take them. So you know what these fellows did? They took a train and went to Edmonton, and they were able to sign up there.
Also the US, those who could,
Or to
us
the
in
US.
South, anywhere. But just imagine you're trying to enlist and you have to cross provinces, you have to go to different places, you have to argue into your way into recruiting centers, or you have to leave the country. You shouldn't have to do that to serve your country.
Well, that was nothing new, because in World War I, two brothers who lived in Kamloops tried to enroll, and they were turned down. So they rode horseback to Alberta and enlisted there and went to France.
Those are the Louis.
Yes.
V10 and Wee Hong Louis of the First World War.
Yeah, and I think just with those anecdotes, as a first generation Canadian, I think it's also goes to say like why these stories are so important, because someone like myself who came to Canada in the 2000s, or more recent generations who immigrated in the last few decades, we came to a Canada where there weren't as many barriers, right? When I was growing up, half of my high school, they were Asian, and really racism wasn't really something that you encountered on a daily basis or even in institutions, broadly speaking. And so growing up, I really never learned about these histories, and neither did my peers. And it's very important to know that this didn't really come out of nowhere, that we're able to live in this cosmopolitan society, as I just Smong talked about. It was because of all those people during the First and Second World Wars who were willing to not only die for our country if it came to be, but to also willing to serve and even not give up when they come back and having done their part.
I think it's appropriate that I should quote this, and this will be also mentioned at the Remembrance Day ceremonies at the Kiefer Memorial after Victory Square. And there's also a new project that you may have seen in the city called the Banners, which have photographs of veterans whose family has paid for the banner, and it was hung up from Victory Square down along Pender Street, and then southward on Main Street all the way to 8th Avenue, and some along the Georgia Viaduct. And there's a goodly number of Chinese Canadians on the banners. The idea is that it'll be up there for several months, then it'll be taken down, stored, and then used again next year. And for those of you who have veterans who did serve and you would like to join that banner project, no doubt you'll get more information, and you can perhaps want to purchase a banner in that regard. But these are the words that I think are suitable and should remember during Remembrance Day. They shall grow not old, As we that are left grow old, age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember.
I feel like that's a good place to end this webinar with those words to remember those who came before us. Yeah, if there are any final questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or get connected with any of our panelists to ask further questions. We are compiling all of the resources that have been shared in the chat today, and we'll send those out in a document to everyone who attended the webinar, so you can do your own further research to help honor and remember these veterans. And yeah, kind of as part of all of that, I do also just want to give a plug for our museum. It was just announced this week, but we are opening a new exhibition in the spring called A Soldier for All Seasons, which will be dedicated to honoring the memories of those who served in the Second World War and also in the First World War. Janice had just put a link to that announcement there. And this exhibition is done in partnership with the Chinese Canadian Museum and the Chinese Canadian Military Museum Society, curated primarily by Catherine Clement, with support by Naomi Louie and our CCM team, Sarah Ling and Melissa Lee. Yeah, any final words that anyone would like to share from our panelists?
I think on behalf of the panel, Rosalie, thank you for organizing and coordinating this evening. Well done.
Thank you for being all here today.